Now, with so many of last year's mega budget blockbusters underperforming at the box office, there's been a call for Hollywood to rein in its alarmingly huge spending. Though if some of the biggest movies releasing this year and next are any indication, executives haven't quite gotten the memo yet. So with that in mind, I'm Ellie for What Culture, and these are 9 upcoming movies with insane budgets. Number 9, Twisters. One of the biggest box office wildcards of the year is Twisters, a standalone sequel to 1996's much-loved disaster thriller Twister. And though the trailer certainly sells the solid cast and glossy mayhem, its $200 million price tag is more than a little concerning. Even accepting that disaster movies about tornadoes inherently don't come cheap, and the original film grossed almost $500 million worldwide, an MCU-sized budget for a 30 years later sequel seems like a colossal, arguably unnecessary risk. The simplicity of its premise and rising popularity of star Glenn Powell will certainly help, but the huge budget means that using the typical 2.5 times rule, it needs to gross $500 million to be a true success. As last year proved beyond any doubt, spectacle alone won't necessarily drive a film to commercial success. The marketing will also need to persuade audiences that this is a can't-miss experience on the big screen that won't hit the same at home. But given the talented cast and crew that are involved, here's to hoping that Twisters is one of the summer's big breakout hits. Number 8, Gladiator 2. There's no reality where a sequel to Ridley Scott's Gladiator is going to be cheap. Between the location shooting, the epic set pieces, and the massive ensemble cast, it was always going to carry a blockbuster budget. Now, Gladiator 2 was initially budgeted at a fair $165 million. It's not an unreasonable increase on the 2000s original, which was $103 million. But recent reports have indicated that the production ran wildly over budget and has actually ended up costing around an eye-watering $310 million. Now, this would rank it among the most expensive films ever made, sitting just a smidge below the likes of Avengers: Infinity War, Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, and Avatar: The Way of Water. Now, this is majorly problematic, as it massively reduces Gladiator 2's chances of being a financial success. Now, it will need to gross almost $800 million to be a hit by Hollywood standards, which is a figure near impossible to reach. Now, even if we accept that some of those costs are due to production being on pause during last year's industry strike action, that's an obscene figure for a historical epic, a genre which hasn't exactly been setting the box office alight in recent times. Number 7, Mickey 17. Mickey 17 is the latest project from Parasite director Bong Joon-ho. And while it's not uncommon for Oscar-winning directors to get a much larger budget for their next film, this is still pretty wild. This Robert Pattinson starring adaptation of Edward Ashton's 2022 sci-fi novel is budgeted at a hefty $150 million, which is considerably more than the collective budgets of all of Bong's entire prior 7-movie filmography. Now, while ambitious sci-fi absolutely commands a sizable price tag, Warner Brothers is said to be less pumped about the end result, which, despite being shot in the second half of 2022, was recently delayed from March 2024 all the way to January 2025. Now, it doesn't paint the most confident picture for the film's commercial viability, regardless of its ultimate quality. And while on one hand it's great to see a respected auteur like Bong getting a blank check, the source material's distinctly weird nature does make it highly unlikely to be very profitable. Number 6, Craven the Hunter. Now, while the majority of Sony's Spider-Man universe hasn't offered up much quality-wise, Sony has at least kept the budgets relatively sensible, with the Venom films costing around $110 million apiece and Morbius and Madam Web both being made for around $80 million. But the studio is scaling up somewhat with their next superhero project, which is Craven the Hunter, which will reportedly set them back $130 million. Now, given that Craven isn't exactly a hugely popular character within the mainstream, especially compared to Venom, the film will have an R rating and the marketing hasn't been stellar so far, this budget immediately places it on the back foot. Now, while the popularity of Aaron Taylor-Johnson and Russell Crowe should help its chances to turn a profit, and it has got one hell of a talented director in J.C. Shandor, the upfront spend is still pretty damn precarious for a film that looks like yet another so-so throwback to early 2000s superhero fare. Number 5, Wicked Parts 1 and 2. Now, musicals have certainly had a rough time of it as of late, with numerous high-profile musical movies such as Dear Evan Hansen, In the Heights and West Side Story flopping in recent years. Enough that studios have actually become shy about even marketing films like Wonka and Mean Girls as musicals at all. Now, a major test for the genre comes this year then, with the long-awaited big-screen adaptation of hit musical Wicked. In a peculiar move though, it's being split into two parts, with Wicked Part 1 releasing this November, and then Part 2 hitting cinemas almost exactly a year later. The films are budgeted at $145 million and $165 million apiece, making for a combined total of $310 million. But there are so many factors working against this one. The decline in cinematic musicals, the divisive casting of Ariana Grande, the perception that Hollywood waited too long to adapt it, and also audiences shying away from showing up for Part 1 movies. Mission Impossible. Now, while it's unlikely that the Wicked duology will outright flop, it might have ultimately made more sense to spend $150 million on a single movie extravaganza rather than spreading the risk across two near equally expensive productions. Number 4, Paul Thomas Anderson's next film. Paul Thomas Anderson may be one of the greatest filmmakers working today, but the overwhelming majority of his movies have been box office flops, with just 2 of his 9 releases to date actually turning a profit theatrically. And yet Anderson's name carries enough clout that studios are still eager to be in business with him and chase Oscars. But even so, his currently untitled next movie carries an absolutely ridiculous budget. The Leonardo DiCaprio starring drama is reportedly costing $115 million, which is a figure almost triple that of Anderson's biggest budget to date, which was Licorice Pizza's $40 million. Now, even with DiCaprio in the lead role, the road to profitability on this one is rough. And even accepting that studios are willing to take the hit to be working with Anderson, that's an obscene amount of money to hand a director with an incredibly poor track record at the box office. For Anderson fans though, it's undeniably exciting to see what he'll do with these resources. Number 3, Michael. There's no denying the massive commercial potential of Antoine Fuqua's upcoming Michael Jackson biopic, given the pop star's enormous global popularity and astronomical success of 2018's Freddie Mercury biopic Bohemian Rhapsody, which grossed $910.8 million on a $55 million budget. But Michael is somewhat disadvantaged right out of the gate due to its gigantic $155 million budget, ranking it among the most expensive biopics, musician or otherwise, of all time. Now, even accepting Jackson's personal controversies, the film could be a huge worldwide hit if it's good enough. But its path to profitability will also be considerably longer due to the substantial price tag. Licensing Jackson's music from Sony certainly can't be cheap, nor the elaborate period costumes and the production design, but spending MCU-level money on a musical biopic can't help but seem quite risky, even when we're talking about the king of pop. Number 2, Joker, Folie à Deux. Even accepting that the first Joker movie grossed a stupendous $1.079 billion, Warner Brothers is taking a considerable risk with the production of sequel Joker Folie à Deux. Now, while the original film cost a reasonable $70 million, considering the cast and production values, the follow-up has been budgeted at a stonking $200 million. Though everyone involved will be getting a significant pay bump from the first film, Lady Gaga likely commands a mighty fee, and the film's reportedly many musical numbers will be pricey to license and produce. That's still a staggering, even concerning price tag. So for context, a Joker sequel is costing $10 million more than Dune Part 2. Given that the theatrical climate is quite different today than in 2019, it's unlikely that Folie à Deux becomes another billion-dollar grosser for the studio. And while it should still perform well enough, that budget presents a massive upfront liability and enormous pressure for it to live up to the original. But as ever, I guess we'll see what happens. And number 1, The Electric State. The Electric State is the next project from the Russo brothers, an adaptation of 2018's dystopian sci-fi novel of the same name. The Netflix-backed shoot ended up costing $200 million. And while the cost of the ensemble cast, which includes Millie Bobby Brown, Chris Pratt, Ke Huy Quan, Stanley Tucci, Brian Cox, Giancarlo Esposito, Anthony Mackie, and Billy Bob Thornton, that does quickly add up, that's still a ton of coin for a movie going straight to streaming. Now obviously we're not privy to the particulars of Netflix's business model, model. But as their most expensive movies to date have been flash-in-the-pan affairs which faded from memory within days, if you think about Red Notice and the Russo brothers' prior film, The Grey Man, both of which also cost around $200 million, it's tough to make sense of this investment. Now, this project at least has some acclaimed source material and one hell of a cast behind it, but even so, in an era where Netflix is planning to stop reporting subscriber numbers, likely due to them imminently plateauing, it can't help but seem like a dubious spend.